recording.
Can everyone hear me if I speak like this?
Yes. Also, please,
Could
if
you
you
be
can
could you be a
turn on
little
your
louder?
camera.
How about this?
Okay.
Is this okay?
Yeah, it's good if you speak like that louder. Thank you.
Cool.
Right. So, if you can turn on your cameras, please do, so that it also helps us to mark the stylistic aspects. If you cannot, it's completely fine. All right. Over to you first.
Starting on my first word. I'd just like to note off the very top of my speech that the US under this debate is acting as a political identity, i.e., this debate is not about the people of the US, but more the government, how the government can function, what the government would like to prioritize. In the speech, a few points on setup and then 2 points about how the removal of the Assad regime furthers the US geopolitical incentives, and then secondly, on the alternatives, who takes power, and why we think this is a good thing. On setup, firstly, what does the removal look like now? What will it look like later? After Bashar al-Assad was ousted in December 2024, Ahmed al-Sharaa was placed as acting president while the country is stabilized and until proper elections can be held. So we understand that if nothing, there is some sense of liberalization that has come about. Secondly, the US interests as a political identity are threefold. Firstly, they claim to be pro-democracy. At the very least, it portrays itself as pro-democracy in order to justify interventions which is beneficial to itself. Thus, any liberalization in Syria, even if it is relative, is a good thing for the US. Secondly, it wants a scope of influence in the Middle East. For example, it funds Israel with a lot of money. Why is this? Because it has strategic oil reserves in that area that are good to have access and influence over, and it's a good geographic position between Europe and the quote unquote enemies like Russia and China. Note how Russia and China are the US's quote unquote enemies for a few reasons. Firstly, they are literally like ideological opposites. Secondly, there's a general paranoia around them becoming like bigger players than the US in the global stage. And finally, note previous conflicts such as the Cold War. Finally, we think it cares about stability. Like you can nickname it the interventionist due to its strong military presence. It spends a lot of its GDP on its militia, but it's not interested in fighting constantly. This might cause some backlash, etc. But note how it does stand up where it feels a moral need to. Finally, we think our burden in this debate is simply to prove that it was morally right and in the interests of the USA more than any practical impacts. Firstly, then, on furthering the US's geopolitical interests, we think that Assad has like a huge anti-sentiment in the US, not only historically, but now. We see examples where the US has morally opposed itself to Assad. For example, in 2013, Barack Obama sanctioned a CIA training program of anti-Assad rebel forces, as well as sending hundreds of millions of dollars in aid, weaponry, both humanitarian and military. We think this somewhat proves moral opposition. But secondly, note how it just imposes huge sanctions on Syria. Syria is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. There is basically an entire ban on trading oil with Syria. Many wealthy elites in Syria have had their assets frozen by the US. See the Caesar Act in 2020 imposing massive sanctions. See the Syria Accountability Act, which was literally made of reducing terrorism and human rights abuses in this region. Thirdly, no, thank you. Thirdly, this anti-regime support is both ideological, as in the US positions itself as a pillar of democracy to justify these interventions, but it's also strategic to have some influence over Syria. Secondly, then, we see that supporters of the Assad regime tend to be enemies of the USA, meaning that any blow against Assad is probably a blow against them as well. The two most notable quote unquote enemies in these regions are Russia and Iran. Let's analyze both. On Russia, we think they literally protected Assad in giving him asylum, but also they have been mainly responsible in military interventions in trying to kill off rebels in Syria. Note how this like literally proves how Russia supports the Assad regime. We think it's good if we can strike a blow against them and get rid of Assad. But secondly, in Iran, for Iran, Syria serves as a crucial path into funding terrorist groups like Hezbollah. Note how they have past allyship. Note that they are used as a conduit conduit for weapons trade. However, Hezbollah, as anti-Israel, means that in order for the US to proposition itself as ideologically opposite, it has to act as pro-Israel. We think this is a generic bad. We think this actually isn't what the US would like to stand for, but they literally do not have a choice. Secondly, we think it sees Syria as a crucial buffer zone. I'll take you in 2 seconds. It sees Syria as a crucial buffer zone from the Saudi and from the West. Note how it's literally a corridor between Russia and like countries that are further south. And so it's important to have some establishment of control in order to block the trade in these regions. I'll take the POI.
Since Trump famously doesn't care about Syria and is isolationist, why wouldn't the new government as well establish connections with Russia and Iran on your side?
We don't think it needs to. That's simply not what we're proving. We're simply proving that us as an inherently bad actor, the US is morally opposed to it, and the US probably has some sense of duty in order to stand up against this regime, considering it not only has done so in the past, but continues to do so in the present with economic sanctions. Not sure where we're getting at there. Second point then on alternatives and why we think these alternatives are good. In these regions, we think it's most likely that the HTS consolidates power. We see that the main other forces in Syria are Turkey and the Kurdish rebels. Why do neither of these take control? The Kurds operate under significant US funding, meaning that if the US wants stability, it's probably going to force them to be moderate, considering they can literally hang their funding over their head. Also, it's just not what the Kurds want. They simply don't want to take over. They simply want to establish their own country, taking some of Turkish land. But secondly, note how Turkey has been entering funding talks with HTS's new government as it views this as a way to hit back at Iran. Note how there's like significant religious schism that eventually becomes political schism between Iran and Turkey. Note how like Turkey mainly follows Sunni Islam, Iran mainly follows Shia Islam, as like most of the key members of government and key members of the military are Shia Islamic. But note how Turkey also wants to expand its influence. So it's not going to unnecessarily antagonize any new regime. This simply does not bode well for the future. Note how, as Assad was mainly an Iranian puppet leader, we simply don't want to letting these people befriend Syria in order to consolidate power geopolitically. But thirdly, just note how other actors like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are like just widely hated. People like Iran, Saudi Arabia, the USA, Russia, even other terrorist groups don't like these extremist groups. Note how the USA literally has military bases in Syria specifically to counter ISIS. But even if groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are like actors that could take control, note how they probably don't because they're terrible at its job. Note how specifically ISIS is very easily predictable because they just follow the prophecy set out in the Quran. So the USA simply positions huge amount of troops next to, say, Raqqa, and ISIS still just keeps single-handedly attacking that one city. But finally, HTS already controls the three biggest cities, i.e. Damascus, Homs, and Aleppo. So note how it's substantially easier to maintain control over taking them over. Why do we think HTS is good then? In areas like Idlib, where they've controlled for ages, women are allowed to go to university, they don't mandate hijabs, they respect civil liberties. But note how this was far before we got huge geopolitical observations, so we can understand that these are genuine. Also, they're anti-extremists. They literally broke away from Al-Qaeda when it was actively harmful to do so. They don't support that rhetoric. Note how Assad is uniquely bad at dealing with terrorists. They literally gas their population. They literally torture them. We think when we can reduce 15,000 people dying in the civil war from incendiary bombs, we think any alternative is literally better on the scale that you cannot get people back from death. Proud to propose.
Thank you so much, Speaker, for that fine speech. We'll now invite first opposition speaker, here.
Okay, just give me a second to set up my notes, and I'll start my speech shortly. Okay, can it be seen and heard?
Yes.
Okay. This is my case. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The side of proposition cannot just examine this fall completely in a vacuum. They have to take in context of everything and what's the likely outcome going to be. In my speech, two main arguments: firstly, on how this causes instability; secondly, on how this leads to better relations with Syria, Iran, and Russia, and why that's not in the US interest. But before that, some points of rebuttal. On their first argument, notice how they cannot just examine and say, okay, like Assad was an immoral person, thus it's it's in the interest of the USA for him to fall. Firstly, we're unsure why the USA cares about how he treats minorities there and how he acts. The USA's interest isn't that minorities; it's always just an excuse to establish dominance in the Middle East. It never cared about democratization. It just wanted oil. Proposition concedes this. So even if Assad was really bad, we are unsure why that's the USA interest. But secondly, notice how they have to prove a comparative. Even if helping minorities there is in the USA interest, they have to prove the HTS that we agree is the likely comparative that comes out is much better. They're likely to be much worse. We'll explain this in our second speech, but shortly, they're very ideologically driven that Assad, even though he was really bad, wasn't, and they're much more extremist in their interpretations of the Sharia and all of the Muslim laws. So that basically deals with notice how this basically deals with their entire case, where they just say, yeah, Assad was bad and HTS is good. They never show why this is in the USA interest and why HTS actually would be good. So, but then just before my arguments, one last point of extraneous rebuttal, where they tell you, oh, Assad was very bad at counterterrorism. He gassed his entire population. He was maybe cruel, he was maybe immoral, but gassing your entire population is very good at counterterrorism, because you also gas the terrorists in the process. He was immoral, but he was good at counterterrorism. First argument then on how on proposition leads to instability. What are the mechanisms on how instability happens? Two main mechanisms. Firstly, notice Assad's fall created a huge power vacuum in the region. When Assad regime fell, 6 terrorist groups tried seizing power. HTS was one of them. A huge power vacuum was created because everyone thought that they could be the ones to seize the power. This means that massive offensives were launched and the war was escalated now that Assad cannot stop all of these terrorist groups. Notice this doesn't get any better, even though HTS technically got control. Why? Because firstly, they still seems much weaker than Assad, and secondly, other terrorist groups will try to fight to at least take some control over the country. Secondly, notice the HTS is really bad at fighting terrorism. 4 main mechanisms. Firstly, they have no army. Once Assad fell, Israel wiped out the entire Syrian army and all of their military bases. This means why? Because they knew that no one could retaliate. The Syrian army was the biggest reason as to why Assad was able to fight off terrorist insurgencies for so long. Why? Because it was a strong army that was very well organized. Secondly, HTS has a lack of experience. Assad regime was 50 years old and had the experience of fighting terrorism. He inherited the regime from his father, who taught him how to fight those terrorists. Thirdly, notice the public sentiment behind HTS. The HTS doesn't represent the majority, they just took the masses. This means that they cannot crack down well on other terrorist groups. Why? Because everyone is just as unhappy with HTS as they were with Assad's regime, because they equally don't represent everyone in the country. They just came ahead of other terrorist groups by a slim margin. And lastly, they have no intelligence. The Assad regime had a lot of connections and mechanisms to get intel on terrorist groups, spies, and secret police. The new government doesn't have the means to collect the same amount of information to know when, where, and how to take down these terrorist groups. Why is this instability important for the USA? 2 main mechanisms. Firstly, notice how it this deals with possible propositions Iran analysis. They can just why? Because Iran can just transport weapons to the parts of Syria that the Syria HTS doesn't control. This means that we mitigate a large extent of proposition's case and show how Iran is still able to get weapons to fuel Hezbollah, even if they're not in good relations with the HTS. Secondly, it leads to a migrant crisis.
Point
This
of
is bad
information.
because firstly, it affects Europe. Last migrant crisis, 6 million people came in Europe. The result was inflation. How? In the EU, wages fell as a consequence of increased workforce. Higher costs of government services because huge influx of migrants caused a strain on social services. And Europeans, as a consequence of this, have lower purchasing power. And this means that America's export suffers because Europeans cannot afford them. Proof is that in 2016, the trade deficit in EU and USA caused $10 billion of damage. And this also affects the USA because USA is clearly against migrants. We see that they ended birthright citizenship, they ended mass deportation. But this new wave of migrants will affect them as well. Not everyone comes to Europe, they likely get in legally. Thirdly, this means that oil prices skyrocket. Insofar as there's a great instability and war, this is bad for oil prices for three reasons. Firstly, you cannot extract oil. Secondly, it destroys infrastructure needed to extract oil. And thirdly, new investors don't come into the region. When not under war, Syrians' production of oil was 10 times greater than when they came into the war. This is really important because the USA illegally controls 90% of Syrian oil fields. This means they're losing revenue by not being able to sell it, and instability means that it's harder for USA to control those oil fields, and it gets easier for terrorists to seize the oil fields. And USA really cares about this. Why? It's the only reason why USA is keeping 2,000 troops in Syria. Before my second argument, I'll take the POI.
How do people not become terrorists when I'm morally disaligned with the government because they are literally gassing me?
Yeah, they do become terrorists. They are terrorists either way, but it is much easier for Assad to control it, thus maintain stability in the region because of the mechanisms I outlined. People are still will be terrorists under HTS. Second argument on countering Iranian and Russian influence. This new government that comes into power needs allies. Why? For three reasons. Firstly, it's just lost its army. Secondly, it needs legitimacy. Why? Because they need to help secure diplomatic recognition, ease sanctions, and facilitate Syria's reintegration into international organizations like the UN and the Arab League. And thirdly, they need money and investment to rebuild the country, the government, and the infrastructure. So who do they choose? The USA is not an option. Sorry to inform the startup proposition, but we are no longer under the Biden administration, which they outlined in Obama's. Trump has been clear about his stance about meddling in Syria. One of his biggest pushes within his campaign is the isolationist policy. He based his campaign on putting America first and stopping the unnecessary spending in other countries. And he specifically said the same about Syria. He said that this is not our fight and we will not get involved. And even in proposition tries to tell you that this will end in 4 years after Trump leaves, it will be too late because the Syria needs allies and someone else will already fulfill this position. We say this will probably be Russia and Iran again. Why? Both Russia and Iran have serious interests within the country. That's why they were in good relations with Assad. Russia gets firstly strategic position. They get access to their only naval base in the Mediterranean. They get air bases in Latakia for the Middle East operations and influence. And secondly, after years of war, Syria's infrastructure is in ruins, and Russian companies have secured lucrative contracts to rebuild oil fields. For Iran, Syria is important because, as proposition agrees, Syria acts as a land bridge for Iran to transport weapons and support Hezbollah in Lebanon, which serves as Iran's frontline force against Israel. Secondly, they have also military bases in Syria. And thirdly, they have construction projects as well. This proves that Russia and Iran have great incentives to double down on Syria so they don't lose the benefits they got until now. How does this flip proposition points about spreading influence? Now, by doubling down, Russia and Iran will get more influence since this new government lacks the money, the military, and the connections the Assad regime had. This looks like another puppet state of Russia that raises its geopolitical influence. Syria not only letting Iran transport weapons to its borders, but outright attacking Israel itself. So because of greater instability and greater relations with Iran, please oppose.
Thank you so much, Speaker, for that fine speech. We'll now invite the second proposition speaker. Yeah.
POIs verbally, please. I will not be looking at chat. There are a couple of really significant and glaring issues in Croatia's case so far, not least of which is the framing. They firstly say that the United States as an actor does not care about humanitarian issues and only cares about dominance and hegemony. How then do you explain that even the Trump administration has decided to keep PEPFAR, which takes up 0.5% of the federal budget, for no other reason than just helping people across Africa not die of AIDS? How then do you acknowledge the fact that the US has launched numerous military interventions, such as those in Korea, such as those in Vietnam, for perhaps misguided, but certainly not hegemonic reasons, certainly not reasons to do with just getting oil? How then do you understand that the US has been in informal contact with HTS for years before it was ever seen as feasible that HTS would take power? It's clear that the US, even if only for the reason that they want to appear benevolent and good to like voters at home, does have some sort of interest in propagating democracy. Secondly, propagating democracy and propagating their hegemony are one and the same. So even if you think that the US is only concerned with global hegemony, that necessitates them having more liberal democracies, and those liberal democracies being more powerful because of the fact that those systems of government are by definition allied with the US as the premier liberal power around the globe. The next piece of framing is they say that we don't have a comparative. They say that the HTS is ideological, whatever that means, and that just because Assad's bad doesn't mean that the US cares about minorities. There are two issues here. Firstly, the US does care about how Assad treats his own citizens because the migrant outflow is actually worse when there's substantial oppression and there are limited mechanisms to repatriate asylum seekers, but more on that later. Secondly, Assad was ideological. As we say in first, Assad ascribed to pan-Arab socialist Ba'athism. What this means is that he has an ideological commitment to be aggressive beyond the territorial boundaries that Syria has. The third thing that they say is that Assad was good at counterterrorism because you can gas the terrorists, and this is the last point of framing. The issue with this is that this is quite the opposite. He radicalizes people against secularism precisely because he's a brutal secular dictator. Why do you think that Syria has always been a hotbed of ISIS militants? Why do you think that Syria has always had issues with people being radicalized and people in the West going to Syria after being radicalized? The reason for this is because Assad is uniquely representative of the evil secular dictator that all of these militant Islamist organizations hate, because of the fact that when you see that a secular rule in your country results in all your friends and family being interned in torture camps and all of your village, like other people in your village being gassed by governmental authorities, you realize that perhaps the only way for you to go is Islamism. The only way to prevent this sort of radicalization is on our side. We flip this. Onto their case then. They say firstly that prop leads to instability. They give a couple of mechanisms. First, that Assad's fall creates a power vacuum and everyone thinks they can seize power. Note how this is not true. In the status quo, there is no legitimate political contender to HTS. They don't engage with this. The single biggest territorial holder are the Kurds in the northeast, which are currently in amicable disarmament talks with HTS. No intention, as we frame for you, to take over all of Syria. There is no credible Islamist opposition. ISIS doesn't even control Raqqa. They don't control any major centers of population, and HTS controls all three major population centers. Therefore, we don't see this as being a problem. They refuse to engage with our analysis. Secondly, they say that HTS is bad at fighting terrorism. Firstly, they say Israel destroyed all of their military bases. But note how Israel itself has an incentive to not continuously do this. The only reason why Israel did this initially is because of the fact that they didn't want, for instance, ISIS taking power in like a bout of particularly bad luck, and then them having numerous hostile neighbors on their borders. Now they have an incentive to collaborate with HTS, as HTS has said that they have no expansionist ambitions in Israel. Secondly, they say HTS has a lack of experience. This is factually incorrect. HTS has had multiple bouts of like armed engagements with Al-Qaeda after they broke off from them. And secondly, HTS has also had numerous armed engagements with ISIS. So this is quite frankly not true. The fact that they've held on to Idlib for this long shows you that HTS does have experience dealing with militant groups. The third mechanism, which is that people are unhappy with HTS, is contingent, so I'm going to ignore it. And the fourth is that they have no intelligence and connections. The issue that I have with this is that they in fact have more intelligence and connections. Who do you think has more intelligence? A secular dictator with limited state capacity ruling over the developed world, or somebody who literally used to be a part of Al Qaeda, who literally used to be a member of one of the biggest terrorist organizations? Since they are more proximate to Islamist groups and they have more on the ground experience fighting against Islamist groups and intelligence gathering about Islamist groups and used to be part of an Islamist group, we think that they have far more of an incentive and of an ability to crack down on terrorism. The next thing that they say, and this is the last piece of rebuttal before I get onto my split, is that HTS needs allies. And they don't choose the USA because the USA is run by Trump. A couple of pieces of rebuttal to this isolationist case. Firstly, foreign policy is decided much more by foreign policy elites than it is by the executive branch directly. Know how the USA commissioned massive airstrikes on Syria in 2017, which was in Trump's first term. The reason for this is that a lot of policy that's to do with Syria is based on non-voted in officials. For instance, people like ambassadors, people like Democratic chairs of defense committees in the House, which mean that Trump has limited ability to actually directly influence policy. Secondly, Trump is not an isolationist. How do you explain aggressive policies like tariffs if Trump is actually an isolationist? How do you explain the fact that even in the first Trump term, the US had an active hand in attacking ISIS militants? Because Trump is above all else positioning himself as being tough on terror, not on being isolationist. He's isolationist in a couple of instances, such as, for instance, in Ukraine, but when it's to do with Muslim terrorists, he relies on Christian nationalists as part of his voter base, so he needs to appear for electoral reasons to be tough on these sorts of people. This is quite frankly not true. Furthermore, Russia and Iran are in the status quo, simply not engaging in any sort of diplomatic talks with Russia or with Iran. They're engaging in diplomatic talks with America and Turkey. So we see empirically this is not true. Furthermore, they have no incentive to do so, since the USA is a much larger economic power than either of the two. I'll take a POI before moving on to my split.
Trump is the one that controls what does the American do. The Congress, which is mostly Republican, and the State of Department, which is chosen by Trump. All of these branches are controlled by Trump, who is isolationist. You cannot just say the terrorists are literally an isolationist policy.
Right. Even if we accept that this is true, Trump still has the incentive that I outlined earlier to appear tough on Islamic terror. But secondly, I tell you that this isn't actually true, because Trump, as the leader of the executive branch, will set a broad foreign policy direction that's up for interpretation by thousands of layers of bureaucrats, all of which are not political appointees. Also, all of the committees, like the Defense Committee, have Democrat representation, which at least mitigates the worst harms of this. Onto the split on Syrian refugees. Couple of layers. Firstly, in the status quo, there are huge issues in the USA and amongst its allies in Europe with migration, as in admitting asylum seekers is generally politically unpopular, especially Muslim ones in the USA, since like the whole war on terror has predisposed the population against this. Secondly, any government that's seen to be admitting Syrian refugees is widely derided. Know how this is non-contingent on the actual number of Syrian refugees, since the media, like the Haitians in Ohio extravaganza, can just spin this massively out of proportion. Thirdly, the USA and American allies can now credibly refuse asylum claims from Syria. Know how they've already been in talks to attempt to do this. Therefore, the US has an incentive to turn away Syrian refugees and has an excuse to now, which is obviously good for the US's political leadership, which can now position itself as being tough on immigration, tough on terrorism, and all of these sorts of things that the political establishment wants to do. For all these reasons, so very proud to stand on proposition.
Thank you so much, second proposition, for that fine speech. We'll now have second opposition speaker, yeah.
Please, just a moment to set up my notes. I'll leave you. Sorry, just to find my timer. Okay, so can someone just say if I'm audible, if this is like a good volume?
Yes, you are both audible and visible.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay. So if that's the case, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Trump is the one who famously got out of the Paris Agreement, out of the World Trade Organization, and has continuously propagated all of the isolationist policies. A proposition cannot just fly from this burden. So in my speech, a few main things. Firstly, on framing and what does like a US actually care about, and does it care about morality? Then I want to talk about Russia and Iran's influence, then about like alternative for governments, and lastly about stability and my last argument. So firstly, on morality. Our proposition tries to push here is the burden. The U.S. necessarily cares about like more moral things and morality. This isn't true for a few reasons. First of all, like historically, the U.S. Has like invaded Afghanistan, invaded things that were like sincerely only in their interest, not things that were moral. And democracy is only like an excuse they use to like. Make an excuse for all of these things they do. Secondly, this was true like historically for America. Trump is the one that you have to defend, is the one who is moral, who cares about morality, who cares about like Assad and minority groups and similar things, because it's not his administration that did like these other moral things. Thirdly, what I want to say is that the geopolitical interest is always above the moral interest. So even if we could concede that they to some extent care about these moral things, we can always see them prioritizing like a geopolitical interest. For example, the fact that they're like largest trade is with China, and with which they are like the largest like moral or democratic opponents or whatever. The implication of this is even if they prove that the HTS is more democratic, this isn't important to them because we proved to you there's greater instability, there's greater terrorist groups, and things that geopolitically actually harm the US and are not in interest of it. And also, even if that's not true, like my argument deals with like the morality part. You'll hear later. So now I want to talk about like Russia and Iran. The only response we get here is that foreign policy isn't really decided by presidents. So the Trump our whole argument doesn't matter. Why this isn't true? Because there's like three people who actually just side about foreign policy. First is Trump. Second is Congress, that is currently mostly Republican, and third is the State of the Department, whose officials are appointed by Trump. This means that if something is in Trump's interest, he will do it. Secondly, about Trump being as an isolationist later. That's like just empirically true. Like terrorists are literally an isolationist policy. I don't see how I have to explain this further. He pulled out of Paris Agreement, out of the World Trade and Health Organization. But thirdly, the only mechanism they provide here is that he has to appeal to his Christian voters because they care about like Islamic terror. Why is it more proximate to the Christian terror, Christian voters? Is that Trump doesn't spend any more money. They like him being as isolationist because they don't want their tax dollars going out of their children's plates to like some wars that are not even proximate to them and that they cannot imagine. They would much likely not want him to like spend all of this money, which means they don't really care about this like really non-proximate Islamic terror. This is why the implication of this is that we prove that necessarily like the new government will have strong ties with Russia and Iran, will have all of the, and we co-opt all of the benefits that proposition has provided. Yeah, I'll take the POI now.
You say that Trump doesn't care about morality in Syria. Why did he order airstrikes in 2017 and 2018 on Syria to remove the Assad regime?
Okay, but you know what he did after that? He said that the groups that were anti-Assad, actually, he cut funding to the groups that were fighting against the Assad because he stopped caring for those things because at that point they weren't something that was geopolitically still in his favor. Now I want to talk about like the alternatives for governments. So what proposition tries to prove here is that this will definitely be HTS and they're democratic. I already said why this isn't important if they're democratic, but secondly, what I want to point out here is that other groups
Sorry, is it just me or did the
Sorry,
audio cut
speaker.
out?
Out for me as well.
You have cut out. I've just paused your timer.
sorry, when did I cut out?
It was just after the response to the POI where you were talking about the order that I was given. So I think you can continue from there from 2 minutes, 55 seconds.
Oh, 2 minutes and 55 seconds.
I have her at 3 minutes and 35 seconds.
Oh, okay. So you heard the answer to the POI, right?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll just continue like my next point after the POI. Okay, then I'll continue my sorry. I'll continue my speech on 3, 2,
one. So onto the point of what happens after this government and does the HTS get in power. Firstly, what we say here, even if the HTS does stay long-term in power and is democratic, this isn't necessarily in the interest of the US. But secondly, what we say is that this causes mass instability. Here, notice panel, we don't have to prove that necessarily like a Kurds take the power and now lead the state. Well, only thing we have to prove is that there is a large number of rebel groups that all have some incentive to grab the power. They don't even have to have a large capacity, but at the moment that there's like 7 of them who strike at once, this creates a great political instability. But secondly, it doesn't even have to be groups who want to like take power necessarily. It can only be Kurds who just want to like annex themselves as like a separate country and don't want to be under the rule of this country. All of these things cause great instability in the country, which we like rebuts their entire point. But secondly, here I want to talk about the terrorist groups, because here they try to negate this and saying no, the secular rule is something that uniquely leads to terrorist groups. This isn't true. This like area has 6 different ethnic minorities, like different religions. This will always inherently have terrorist groups and ways of like a great indoctrination to pull people in these terrorist groups. Mine already provides you detailed analysis on why on our side terrorist groups actually grow like even more prominent, which is inherently not in the interest of the US. But now I want to focus on the more on the point of stability. So firstly, I already proved to you why terrorists have like easier, for example, access to oil once there is greater instability, which is definitely not in the interest of the US. Because, for example, ISIS would when they had access to like oil reserves in 2015, in Syria became the richest terrorist organization, which is definitely against the interest of the US. But also on the stability point. They try to say that new government has like a lot of like intel, a lot of capacity, and the Assad didn't have a lot of capacity to battle the terrorists. This is inherently wrong. They say this themselves when they point out to you that they will efficiently gassing all of their opponents. Among those were the terrorists, and also like they had a lot of oil. They had like international recognition and a lot of spies which they can use to actually hold this stability. I think we already proved this point, but now I would like to extend our case with our last argument about the HTS being oppressive, which leads to an even more instability and migration. Notice this is the best case in proposition. So it means even if we take their second argument and that HTS forever stays in government, why are they not good? They're not democratic, and even that's not true. They lead to more instability. So 2 mechanisms here. Firstly, they're very oppressive because they're extremely paranoid. They're a new government that just consolidated control. They're scared that other groups are going to want to get in power. That means rebel groups. That means like other countries like Turkey or fractions of their group that differentiate themselves. And what they do then is they order severe crackdowns due to this paranoia. We've already seen them being oppressive, and this will only multiply. For example, with them repressing political opponents, for example, the Syrian Liberation Front, whose members they tortured, for example, confiscating territory from civilians and potential political opponents. Also, them forcing like 14-year-old boys into their ranks because they desperately want any kind of defense, or economically exploiting like farmers and providing like must-pay protection fees, which is also a sign of oppression for civilians. But the second thing they do is that they're more ideologically driven than the past government. This means that they used to be part of the global jihad. They're based like their entire agendas on strict interpretation of the Sharia or the Islamic law. So please panel note that them being ideologically driven means they don't necessarily make decisions in their best interest or the ones that are rational. That means that they oppress people more. For example, women's rights, who are required to wear a hijab in public and have heavily restricted education, means journalist crackdowns like those in 2023 or what is important here, this becomes worse even more over time, because now is the time they seize power and they're already doing these bad things to the civilians, but over time they'll grow more secure and even more radicalize themselves, like we've seen with the Taliban, because then they can afford to be more oppressive. The impact of this is firstly that the oppression of citizens and other rebel groups will lead to even more political instability and retaliation from armed groups and outraged civilians, which is all the impacts for the first argument. But secondly, even if this oppression is 100% successful and there's no capacity to fight back, people migrate and flee from this oppressive regime. They migrate to Europe, they migrate to US. This creates a large inflation crisis and all of the things Marian already talked about. Because of all of these things, strong opposition.
Thank you so much, second opposition speaker, for that fine speech. We'll now invite the third speaker from proposition.
So I'll just start on my first word. Sorry, my camera's not functioning either. Apologies. Panel, we think that when opposition believes our entire case hinges on Trump being a moral actor, and they deny the fact that gassing your own citizens is an active hotbed for causing greater extremism in the region, we think they've ultimately lost the debate. What I'm going to do for you today, I'm going to prove why morality is not the final delta on this debate and why we still give you a number of practical reasons as to why the US would want to get involved and actually make them more coherently, have a better coherent relationship with Syria. Then we're going to deal with the issue of which one can guarantee better stability and prove why all of our unresponded mechs still weigh over in this debate. So to begin with, what we get first out of O1, when they talk about Trump and just US in generally not caring about minorities and using it as an excuse for expansion, right? My second speaker tells you that even if it is only like optic, which we pretty much accept, the US still relies on actually doing good. It still relies on liberal governments naturally being aligned to the US, and it is advantageous for these liberal democracies to come in, right? And the kind of liberalism that we tell you in our P1 occurs when after Assad's deposition, we ultimately get elections to be held, right? There is a process of liberalization that means that it is a positive, closer relation to the US if Assad is deposed for the US, right? But even if you don't buy that, like the actual morality is relevant, we think that generally Trump like still has number of practical incentives to care about actually getting involved with Syria, right? Because ultimately, we still win on proving that the HTS moves away from Russia and Iran, because ultimately they want to distance themselves from Assad, who was essentially their puppet state, right? And in following Assad's footsteps, they ultimately, make themselves like wildly unpopular. Secondly, we think that they already have like different theological views from Iran, and HTS fighters ultimately like oppose Iranian authorities, like ideologically, all of these reasons which go unresponded to. But they try and tell us that, oh, but actually Trump has a sort of a Christian base, but we think that this is simply like a strange mechanism, because presumably, one, Christians do actually care about the morality of these situations, and two, even if not, and they're the deep south kind of Trump cult Christians, which we imagine the opposition are imagining, they still have a number of incentives to practically get involved and to stop the Assad regime, in the sense that Trump and Trump's entire position is based on being hard on terror. As much as they want to push isolationism, which I will deal with later, as much as they want to push isolationism, Trump needs to be tough on foreign terror, and specifically in his group, tough on Muslim terror. This is like his key political point, is that he's strong on these groups which are ruining America, and he can make it great again, right? So these Christians want to be hard on what they perceive to be Muslim terror, which is Assad's essentially dictatorial regime. But more than that, they have like actual economic advantages as they concede in their case. Like if you have oil fields in Syria, which are illegally owned by the US, as they point out, then presumably in order to fulfill Trump's drill baby drill prophecy, you're going to need to stop terrorist mayhem actually disrupting that revenue, right? And it's going to be worse. And this is contingent on proving that it's actually going to be worse under Assad for terrorism, which leads on to the point then that they basically woefully misunderstand how terrorism, how terrorism comes about. We tell you in second that ultimately, if you are torturing your citizens, if you're interning them, if you're gassing them, right, this is going to produce further extremism. Their only response to this is, okay, but you also kill the terrorists. But this ignores the fact that it puts them in extreme opposition to extreme like Islamist groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, which they distance themselves from. No, thank you. Because they see this secular leader as ultimately like attacking their own civilians, attacking everything that they stand for, right? In this way, Assad is actually like a hugely bad actor for worsening terrorism. We tell you a number of other reasons which go unresponded to out of first, not just in that he causes it on his own, but that ultimately he's like supporting the supporters of the Assad regime are also enemies of the US, right? So Russia has direct military interventions to protect Assad. They protect him with asylum. Ultimately, for Iran, Syria is like a path to funding terrorists like Hezbollah, which ultimately puts the US in opposition to them because they're like pro-Israel, and ultimately Syria and Iran like become like sort of pro-Hamas, right? And pro-Hezbollah. These kinds of tensions, we think, are exactly what is going to fuel conflicts getting worse, and which ultimately they give us no exact response to. No, they're going to take it in a minute. They give no response to, right? Whereas we actually tell you why HTS is better. They try and tell us that HTS gets worse because it's unable to fight terrorism because it has no army and it lacks this sort of experience, which all gets rebutted in my second. But I'll remind you again, the Syrian army obliterated by Israel is contingent on Assad being sympathetic to like Hezbollah, right? Now that HTS comes in and is already told you we've already told you there is a split in their ideological approach. Assad was expansionist. HTS is literally not. That means that ultimately Israel no longer perceives Syria to be a threat. They have that incentive to work for them, right? They have the incentive to try and get some influence in the area. The same as Turkey, who has opposition to Iran. The same as Saudi. Like, even if you don't buy that the US steps in to like gain a healthy relationship, which we think we've thoroughly proven, there's no chance that this descends into like a terrorist power vacuum, because all of the other actors in the area have incentives to exert control. They don't want to take over. It'll be easier to control it through funding HTS and be able to exert your influence in that way. But before I carry on, I take a POI.
None of which you are saying is exclusive to Assad. HTS still dislikes a good part of the country because they're ethnically divided. People still feel unrepresented by the HTS just they were by Assad, and HTS will still be even better with Iran and Russia because they need some allies and don't have the privilege
We've just told you
that
they are ultimately theologically like opposed to Iran, and we don't see like how you respond to this. And we also tell you that the HTS, they stand for generally liberal values. We give you Idlib, where they have they allow women to go to university. They don't mandate the hijab. We say in our setup that elections will come about on the fall of Assad, which means that this is generally like a liberal place. You know, the Syrians were seen actually like celebrating after the fall of Assad. Like, this is a positive thing. We don't see how your point seems to stand there when they're like one of the major influences and one of the major political contenders to take power, right? So now that that's out of the debate, we tell you that the HTS is actually going to be a positive influence to like pretty much sort of no response for the reasons that I've just noted in the response to that POI there. But ultimately, because the other groups in the area are unlikely to be able to seize control. The world that opposition imagines, where like Islamist and extreme terrorist groups come in, is so unlikely because we tell you there are US military bases in order to step in against terrorist groups like ISIS, like Al Qaeda, and ultimately these people are generally like isolated from allies. No one wants to work with ISIS. No one wants to work with Al Qaeda. And ultimately, HTS have actually distanced themselves from Al Qaeda previously. And we think that this constitutes a positive relationship with the US because ultimately they have distanced themselves from those extreme groups. Like, we see clear intention in their treatment of Idlib. We see clear intention of their distance from those groups. We see clear intention of the stating of their policies that they don't want to subscribe to the same sort of Baathism, which Assad, we tell you, was actively enforcing and actively looking to worsen through his support with other terrorist groups. And ultimately, the impact of this is that the US is able to have a coherent, and positive working relationship with Syria because they'll be incentivized to work for it for all of the economic reasons we've given you, for all of the perceptional reasons we've given you, and for like the morality reasons. But ultimately, even if you don't buy that the morality reasons is true, like all of our other reasons still stand. We don't see how they've managed to convince you that the HTS is bad at fighting terrorism when they have been a long-standing political group in this area. And ultimately, by working better with the US, this means that the area becomes like more stable. There's less terrorists. We tell you that like terrorists are like characteristically bad for the US, seen as like the pillar of, you know, everything which they abhor. And in this sense, for the US, their interest in keeping stability, in appearing strong, in having an international presence, and being unchallenged by terrorist threats all benefit. Please vote proposition.
Thank you so much, Proposition 3, for the fan speech. We would like to call upon Opposition Third. Yeah.
Just a second to set up my notes and I'll be with you. Okay, just to set up my timer. Okay. I'll start my speech at my first word. I'm really sorry for the side of proposition. I mean, I'm happy for them that they're living in the illusion that the Biden is still in a president in America, and that we did not have the elections that we had, that Trump has not been elected president. But because that has not been true, because this is not a month ago, and because we know that the Trump is in the administration right now, we know that he is isolationist, and that a lot of rebuttal and a lot of the positive content that the side of proposition tries to push onto us is just simply not true. In my speech, a couple of points of clearing up the debate, and then two clashes, first about instability and secondly about geopolitical influence. But please note, panel, at the top of my speech, that the side of proposition has no positive content. First, their point about immorality was literally dropped in second speech and has not been repeated after the first speaker. And secondly, their only other positive content about flipping their only other positive content is flipping our instability because they're radicalized. If we prove literally that this doesn't happen, they have no positive content that stands on their side. Now, again, to clear up before my clashes, I first want to note again that Trump is isolationist. Is isolationist and has the control to control what is going to happen with America's relations with Syria, because the Congress has mostly Republican people. The State of Department is literally chosen by the president itself, which means that if we prove that he is isolationist, he's the one that can control what happens in Syria. And secondly, the side of proposition never proved the comparative that elections will actually happen, and they will happen just more than once. We tell you that this is not the case because these are terrorist organizations that have no incentive. They're ideologically driven. Like all the other countries in the Middle East, we have never been proven why they will actually get here and have democratically elected people in power. First clash then about instability. A couple of questions under this clash. First, who fights terrorists better? The side of proposition tries to tell us that Assad radicalized these terrorist groups, so it's going to be worse on their side. We want to say that these terrorist groups are radicalized on both sides because first, these groups happen here because of ethnic differences. You cannot have a stable country with these groups when it's so ethnically divided. We literally have Kurds on the north. We have other ethnic groups. These are the groups that have ideological religious differences. This is not simply just because of Assad, which means that we still have these groups which have all these ideologies on their side. But secondly, these groups exist still on both sides no matter why they happened, which means they didn't go away with the fall of Assad. This means that the side that proves that the government will going to be better towards reducing these terrorist groups is the side that wins, because these terrorist groups still exist on both sides. So how do we have the capacity better to fight these terrorist attacks? Because on their side, this new government has no army. Like we told you, Israel bombed all the military that after the Assad fell, which means that the Assad was awful, but he was affecting what he was doing. He was the one that spread terror, but that is the way that most of the terrorist groups were it was really, he was in power for 50 years. It was really you had to have really good ways to fight these terrorist groups if you were in power for 50 years. Well, this new government has no army. We told you that this government has a lack of experience. Proposition tries to tell us that you actually have more experiences because you still fight. But please, let's look at this comparatively. This Assad spent 50 years in power, which means he has 50 years of experience fighting specifically against these terrorist groups and how to stay in power. And C, we told you that on their side, you have no intelligence. They try to flip this point by saying that they fight, that there are they are terrorist organizations, so they have the information. But we want to tell you that Assad has a secret police. It has connections. It has loyalists. It has infrastructure for 50 years to gather all of this information, which means we have a lot of more army, more experience, more intelligence to actually fight these terrorist organizations. And Assad has been doing that for 50 years. We have it more on our side, which means the terrorists, we can fight it better on our side. Second point under this clash, does a power vacuum happen? We told you that terrorist groups fight and seize power on their side when they see that there's a power vacuum. They want to tell us that you have no political opposition, this will not happen, and that these groups don't want to seize this power. We want to say that there's no need for political opposition. This is terrorists just want to capitalize, they don't want to take over the whole country, just a bit of more power. It doesn't matter to be a political opposition. They will just try and get more power. But again, there's just these are just some some ethnic and religious differences. Like we have Kurds in Turkey that really want to capitalize off of it so they can like annex themselves because they want to be a separate country, which means there are some ideological differences. Plus, we have other regional powers like Turkey that which want to like get involved so they can take the part where they're where the Kurds are situated with, which means that we have the power vacuum. They cannot just say no political opposition. They have these ideological differences and the reasons why they actually reasons why the power vacuum will actually happen. So what is the impact on the US of this clash? We said it first, Iran and Russia will still going to be powerful on their side because they will use this instability to still propagate and like so the weapons can go through Syria. Secondly, we told you about the migrant crisis that will happen when a civil war and a lot of this instability actually happens. The side of proposition tries to tell us, oh, more people are going to go on migrant when Assad is there, when the Assad is in power, but we are the ones that saw that when there was a civil war, like a Syrian civil war, that is when there was so much in Syria. That was the moment in which so many migrants went into Europe, went into America, and caused so many economical problems. There's going to be less migrants on our side. And third point, we told you about the oil, how you have less supply, so this will pump up prices for America, which is of course not in their interest. And how without stability, even more instability, more terrorists, this is they will seize the oil fields. So please, let's weigh these on exclusivity of impact, because only on our side we will have more stability, which is in the interest of America. Second clash then about geopolitical influence. Why would you not weigh this clash on morality as the main interest? Because first, this is just an excuse for America, like we already told you. When they went to South America as fighting communism, but they actually put people in these countries, and force countries to be economically dependent on them. They don't actually care about democracy and minorities. This would not happen on their side. Secondly, there are already other countries with which America cooperates with, which are ideologically not aligned with them, but it's still in their interest to cooperate with them and to continue this cooperation, even if it's, for example, China, which they're ideologically not aligned, but it is still in their interest to actually cooperate. And thirdly, they never proved why the comparative of HTS is better. Note a third argument why this is not true. We told you that these HTS is going to be paranoid, because they are afraid that they're going to not stay in power, which means they're going to do all the same things that Assad did, like bombing or like killing all of the people. But B, we told you that they're ideologically driven. They literally take their religion more like seriously than the Assad did, which means they're going to be like the Taliban. We can like the Taliban as well. We want to tell you that will Trump actually get involved then? We said at first that he's an isolationist, and secondly that Trump literally said that this was not their problem, and in the last administration he stopped funding. We want to say that the Christians that he's trying to appease, they're against him spending more money on these countries. This was literally, please panel, you know that he's isolationist. You know that the main problem Christians and Republicans had with Biden was that he's spending so much money on Israel, which means that the comparative is that Russia and Iran will have, and please, this means that it is not in the interest of the US for Russia and Iran to have more geopolitical influence in the Middle East. This is not in the interest of the US. Please, opposition.
Thank you so much, Speaker, for that fine speech. I will now call upon the opposition leader to give us their reply speech.
Okay. Can I be seen and heard?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, I'll deal with the characterization of USA.
Sorry, Speaker.
Yeah.
Can you start afresh? You immediately broke out.
Okay, sure. Can I just maybe turn off my camera? Maybe it's causing that.
If you think that will help, then sure, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll try. Okay, I'll be starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. So firstly, I'll characterize the US, then I'll deal with propositions positive content because there's not that much, and then lastly, I'll explain how exactly we win this debate. So firstly, to characterize the USA, 3 points made here. Firstly, notice how the main goal, main thing they care about is firstly instability, and then secondly, geographic presence in the Middle East. Proposition agrees that they care about instability and about the situation in the Middle East, about Syria's relations to Iran and Russia. So I think we'll base this debate on those two metrics. Why? Because instability, because of high oil prices and the immigrant crisis. Secondly, we think they don't care about morality for 3 reasons. Firstly, when they use the excuse, it's just a facade. It was just a facade to implement their own people to take more control over either Asia or the Middle East. Secondly, notice that we see this is true because they stopped fighting Assad. In 2019, Trump's even though Obama tried, Trump stopped funding these terrorist organizations to take down Assad. And thirdly, they even trade with China and Russia, they think are the countries that are the least moral. They're their biggest opponents. Thirdly, notice that the USA is currently led by Trump. What does this mean? He's a very isolationist. We see this is true by his politics. He has high tariffs, which are unnecessarily isolationist. He's pulling out of international organizations like the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, Paris Agreement, and he's deporting illegal immigrants, and he's spending less on helping other countries. For example, he stopped funding Ukraine. And notice why this is true, because people in America don't want their money wasted. And furthermore, Trump can do whatever he wants. Why? Because he controls the majority of the Senate, the parliament, and he appoints the heads of the cabinet. The implication of this point is that firstly, he won't have diplomatic ties and help Syria because he just doesn't care enough, and he cares less than other countries, even if he cares to an extent. And secondly, he doesn't care about the minority treatment in Syria and the whole morality point, even if the USA as a whole cares. What is then proposition's positive content? Firstly, they tell you Assad is bad because he treats immigrants bad and he's not democratic. Firstly, they never prove the comparative. Why would they have democratic elections? Why would this new HTS government be better? In our second argument, we prove they're more Muslim, they're more identity oriented, and so on. They're likely worse. But secondly, they never explain why this is important to the USA. We explain many times why it's not. Second, then positive content is that they say that suffering the Assad caused leads to radicalization. Firstly, this is not exclusive to Assad. The HTS will still try and do this, they fight these terrorist groups, and in the process radicalize people. But secondly, this is not the root cause of terrorism in Syria. Why? Because they have vast ethnic and religious differences. When Assad fell, literally 6 terrorist organizations tried fighting for power. They have the Kurds. They have people who are more Muslim, less radical Muslims, and so on. And the root cause is that people don't feel represented by Assad, which is still true for HTS because they were not democratically elected. But weighing this, insofar as Assad can stop the terror he created, the USA doesn't care about this, him creating more instability if he fixes it himself. How do we win then? Firstly, on instability, where we tell you these terrorist groups now have larger incentive to cause instability because they see a power vacuum, and secondly, the new HTS doesn't have the capacity to stop them because they don't have intel, they don't have the army, and so on. Secondly, we win on the fact that Syria will now be closer to Russia and Iran. They don't have access to being allies with the USA, but they necessarily need to make allies, so they side with Russia and Iran. Why are we better? What is the comparative here? When in Assad's last year, he actually stood up to Iran and Russia because he had the capacity. He had an economy, he had an army, and he wasn't so reliant on Russia and Iran. This new HTS Syrian government will be solely reliant on Russia and Iran because they fund the army and help him fight terrorists to an extent. They subsidize his economy. They are the ones that help HTS gain legitimacy in the international grounds. That's why they will always have to listen to Russia and Iran. This is significantly worse because now they fight Israel together with Iran. They help Russia do these bad things. That's not in the interest of the USA. This is why opposition wins.
Thank you so much, opposition leader, for that fine speech. To round up the debate, we'll invite proposition leader Yaya.
Under Assad, the Syrian airwaves replaced the call to prayer with Ba'athi chants of death to America, death to Israel, and death to the enemies of the Arabs. The population is brainwashed, told stories from a young age about how the Lion of Damascus is the only thing standing between them and Islamic extremism. No wonder why people are radicalized. No wonder why America was so keen to get him out. Four things in this speech. Firstly, on the incentives of the USA. Secondly, on if the USA ends up helping. Third, on even if the USA does not help, does HTS still survive? And fourth, on this whole comparative point, which they like to make a big deal of later down the bench, and why HTS is good. Firstly, on US government incentives and interests. They try to say that whenever the US claims to support democracy, that it's actually lying. We give you numerous examples of this not being the case. We tell you that the entire Cold War, perhaps, was a whole exercise in something not being in the best interest of the USA, on a total money pit that they fought solely for ideological reasons. We tell you that the average American citizen strongly supports things such as liberalism and strongly supports things such as fighting terrorists. So this is quite frankly untrue. The next thing is that we don't hang our hat on this. Note how we engage in both worlds where they only engage in one. They only engage in a world where the US is a cartoonish villain. We tell you that even if the US is not going to be moral, that they still have strategic interests in preventing Russia and Iran from being involved. The next thing is, does the USA help because of Trumpian isolationism? The issue that we have with this is that, again, they have this cartoonish conception of the USA under Trump as being a comedy villain actor. We tell you that, firstly, the USA has some isolationist incentives. If it doesn't directly affect their hegemonic position, they will be isolationist. Since the USA thinks that Europe can handle Ukraine, they let Europe handle Ukraine. Since the USA thinks that Taiwan can't handle Taiwan, under Donald Trump, he places tariffs on China and he drastically increases the amount of military troops circling Taiwan. It's clear that this is an unnuanced position for them to hold. Thirdly, we still win even if the US is this isolationist force, because even if they don't help, as we tell you from first, tons of actors in the Middle East have huge incentives to ensure that HTS survives. Note the Sunni-Shia schism, for instance, whereby Saudi Arabia, whereby Turkey have huge incentives to prop up a fellow Sunni Islamic regime in opposition to Iran, which they view as the main source of unrest in the region. So even if, and note how this is really damaging to their case, we accept that the US totally doesn't intervene, tons of regional actors have incentives to build up their army, have incentives to fund their economy, have incentives to defend them against terrorists and against external threats. On to the fourth one then. If they survive, are HTS good? And is the comparative legitimate on our side of the house? The answer is clearly yes. We proved to you that even before HTS was under any sort of international pressure, even before they had any incentive to conform to what the US wanted them to do, they were still allowing women to go to universities in Idlib. They were still allowing a huge degree of civil liberties, and they were still wholeheartedly rejecting the fundamentalism of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They break away from Al-Qaeda for the sole reason that they ideologically disagree. It would have been beneficial for them to stay with Al-Qaeda, and it would have been beneficial for them to be substantially more totalitarian, yet they still do not. In comparison, Assad is a bloody, brutal tyrant who gasses his own population. When you are a Muslim and you see a secular ruler murdering off other people who follow your branch of Islam, note how Assad is an Alawite and the average citizen of the country is a Sunni Muslim. You see the failings of secularism and you believe that the only way is Islamism. Assad is the worst person to prevent terror. Assad, under his regime, there was constant uprisings by ISIS. In comparison now, HTS controls all of the major population centers of Syria, something Assad never managed to do, and has the popular wide backing. Note how this means we conclusively win on every single ground that even they want to win on, and they engage in none of the ones that we do. For all these reasons, so very proud to stand on side proposition today.
Thank you so much.